Thank you so much, Nancy. Thanks, everybody, for being here tonight. And first, I just want to offer, as always, our great appreciation for the team at Inform for hosting the School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture book launches. We're always really happy to hold them in this beautiful space. So thank you very, very, very much. Before we get started with tonight's program, I want to provide a little bit of history and an update on our series project. This project began with the idea of publishing just one book. When friends Barbara and Judah Shumiater informed me that they were selling their beautiful and crazy enigmatic house in Point Grey, we all knew that it was very likely to be destroyed because of escalating land values. So they had never documented the house that Judah had designed himself. And so we set out to be sure that there would at least be some permanent record of its existence. I joined forces with photographer Michael Perlmutter, who lives in Sweden, and graphic designer Pablo Mandel, who lives in Buenos Aires, to produce a single volume. By the time of the book launch, the house had sadly, but predictably, been razed. So Victor Hugo was quite right when he described in The Hunchback of Notre Dame that books are in fact more durable than buildings. This story is all too common in our region. So at the encouragement of the late and our beloved Joe Way, I joined forces with my Sala colleagues, Sherry McKay and Chris McDonald, who are here tonight, to co-edit and co-curate a full series that would document, in the best case, it would document houses and help save them, and we've had one success. And in the worst case, they would be documented so that there would at least be a permanent record of them if they were destroyed, as in the case of the Shumiater house. The houses we have selected for the series were built between roughly 1940 and 75. They're all sitting on plots of gold. We decided collectively that each monograph would feature a house by a different architect and each would have a different author. Michael Perlmutter would do all the photographs and Pablo Mandel would design the whole series. So Chris McDonald, after House Shumiater, Chris McDonald launched Downs House 2 in the fall. Maybe some of you were here for that. And tonight, we're very excited to launch our third book, Merrick House. And 2 weeks from now, we launch The Binning House. And 2 weeks later, The Friedman House by Lasserre, written by UBC professor Richard Cavell. I would say, now we got ourselves a series. And then, that's not the end of the story, because in the fall, Adele Weider, Adele, where are you? In the back. She has already finished her book that's coming out in the fall on The Cop House by Ron Tom. And then in the spring, Michael Probokoff from Toronto, professor at OCAD, is publishing a book on Arthur Erickson's Smith House 2, where Gordon Smith currently lives, with an introduction by Doug Copeland. So by this time next year, we're going to have 7 books. So we're really excited about that. Matthew Souls will be presenting his book in 2 weeks from now, the Binning book. So tonight's, we want to thank the many people who have contributed financially to the series generally through Sala's Friends and Alumni account, or through named gifts. And I'm just going to read a few names because we're so grateful to them. The Christopher Foundation, Bryce Rossich, Terry Lyons, Julie Paul, and Whitney Lyons, Keith Hemphill of Rossich Hemphill Architects. Others have contributed to specific books, including our hosts, Nancy and Niels Benson. Tonight, we offer our gratitude to Paul Merrick's longtime engineer, Bog Babicki. Is he here? Where is he? There he is. Hi, Bog. Thank you very much for your great gift for this book. And also to Merrick Architecture for their contribution. These are essential because publishers don't pay for books anymore. Tonight's program will feature author Tony Robbins in conversation with architect Paul Merrick, followed by a Q&A. Jeanette Langman and Alistair Johnson, the current and loving owners of this crazy 17-level treehouse, will join our conversation. And I'm sure if you would like to know about how it is to live in that house or how to maintain it, they would have an awful lot to say about that. So now to introduce tonight's key speaker, who will be in conversation with Paul Merrick, author Tony Robbins. Tony has had a successful career across several creative mediums: art, writing, interior design, and architecture. As an architect, he has an international presence with projects and awards from Tel Aviv to Japan. He is the recipient of many prestigious awards, I had to shorten the list, including a Canada Council Prix de Rome in architecture, 2016 Best House in Canada by the International Property Award Committee, and Western Living Magazine's 2014-15 Designer of the Year Award for architecture, interior design, and eco-design, the first time those three awards have all been given to a single person. Tony's work has also been published in over 80 publications internationally. In addition to practicing architecture, Tony occasionally, when we can convince him to do so, teaches design studios in Sala, and I must say gets incredibly beautiful work from our students. He also writes in different genres. He's published fiction, 3 option screenplays, and relevant to our series, an essay in Adele Wieder's effort, Ron Tom and the Allied Arts Exhibition Catalog. So we are super lucky to count Tony Robbins among the authors in the West Coast Modern House series. Now at last, I turn the evening over to Tony.
I never recognized that kind of intro. It should include things like Loves, Dogs, and Radiohead. But anyway, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It's daunting to see so many friends out there. So I extend my thanks also to those mentioned by Leslie. By the way, can you hear me at the back? Is everything good? And so I have a few others to mention. Leslie, of course, for inviting me to contribute to the series, and for her unending care to the end. And to Jeanette Langman and Alistair Johnson for their incredible custodianship of this house. It wouldn't be here today without them. They care for it, and it's been wonderful to get to know them as well. I'd also like to thank Zafira Bacchus for the 3-dimensional drawings in the book, and of course, last but not least, to Paul Merrick for sharing so much with me. So the focus of this event is on the celebration of the book rather than a lecture on the house. So this is a still, and I'll be doing some readings and we'll be talking to Paul. So as architects, we are charged to create spaces that lift our spirits, to stop us in our tracks. And we travel thousands of miles to have that 15-second first experience of that. You know, my favorites are Pantheon in Rome, Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona Pavilion, and there are many more. But what's very difficult and very hard is to create that in domestic space. So, you know, comparing a cathedral to kitchen, dining, living is you know, what we're looking at. So I just can't tell you how surprised I was to find that experience in the woods in West Vancouver. I was just, you know, blown away. I'd been invited to check the house out by Leslie and Jeanette and Alistair to see if it might be a contender for the book. And of course, within 15 seconds, I was sold. So I guess you can guess which house I'm talking about. So what wasn't surprising to me was that I went home and wrote 9,000 words on the book, on the house. And what I didn't know that this book was meant for very small coffee tables. And so I then worked with Leslie as chief editor, and we whittled it down to 3,000 words to be in line with the series. And I have to say, by reducing it like a good sauce, it got better, and the flavor was very much enriched. Some of the things that got lost were really not quite on focus, but I had a treatise on the energy crisis and the advent of double glazing, which of course was not very relevant to this house because the 30-foot high walls that create the main space are made of single glazing. Another thing that got lost, well, not lost, but it was relegated to the endnotes, was my interest. It spoke to my interest in influences and inspirations, and it was attributed to John Cage. So my first reading, and I hope this is the first ever reading of an endnote at a book reading, is to do with that. And the reason I'm reading this is because an hour ago I first saw this book. It was rush couriered for tonight, and I noticed that the endnotes are in like 4-point font. So I figured nobody's ever going to read that, so I'm going to read it for you. I'm actually going to read my notes, which has the quote. It'll be easier. Oh, that's mine. Yes, very good. Okay, here's the bookmarks. I'm still going to read this one. So, the endnote. John Cage is attributed to saying that when you are painting, as with designing buildings, you are not alone in the room. Surrounding you is a host of teachers, family, peers, and critics. And they're saying, this is not in the endnote, they're saying things like, oh, I wouldn't do that, and things like that. And as you get better at it, they begin to leave the room. Now, Merrick was one to push them out of the room as soon as possible, but one person stayed for quite a long time into his career. And I'm holding back the name of that person because it's in the next reading, so I'll just let you know that that person had his own lingerer, and it was Frank Lloyd Wright. And so we see this rich history in Paul's house of both his mentor and Frank Lloyd Wright. Cage went on to state that when you're really good, you leave the room. And what he means by that is that the act of creativity becomes automatic. And that's the magical moment that we all love that, if and when it happens. And so this occurs across many different mediums. And I have a writer friend who called to say that his main character in his book had killed himself, as if he had nothing to do with it. And he was angry. So this leads to the first real reading, which is actually the introduction to the book. I think it's easier to read it from this. So when Paul Merrick was 14, he became enthralled by an unusual house taking shape around the corner from his parents' home in West Vancouver. He would spend many hours leaning on the fence, watching cranes positioning wood beams to the sound of construction echoing in the woods. The house was designed by architect Ron Thom, who turned out to be a prominent figure in 20th century Canadian culture and later in Merrick's career. Merrick's experience at this construction site inspired his very interest in the making of buildings, a spark that led him to pursue an architectural degree at UBC and later to embrace Thom as a mentor. He worked with Thom in the office of Thomson Barrett Pratt and later followed him to Ontario to work on the University of Trent campus. Thom's formative influences are ingrained in most of Merrick's work, evidenced in the ornamented rhythms, rich materials, and spatial moves. The lineage of this sensibility traces directly back to one of architecture's grand masters, Frank Lloyd Wright, and stands in sharp contrast to the sparse interiors and blank walls, characteristic of the more modern movement, followed by many of Merrick's contemporaries. By 1972, Paul Merrick had become a very talented and confident young architect in his own right. As a new partner and lead designer in a highly reputable Vancouver firm, he had designed one of the most iconic buildings in Canada at the time, Vancouver's CBC building. In the evenings, however, with a drawing board propped on his front porch, he let loose on the design of a home for himself and his young family, a building that would define his design ethos. This monograph is a record of the delicate, majestic wonder resulting from that vision over 45 years ago. It reveals the fragility of the Merrick House through the building's evolution, improbable tenure, and near demise. The house has thankfully endured, but only briefly. Nestled on a wooded hillside, the house is truly contextual, but eccentric and outrageous at the same time. It is not a house anyone would contemplate designing or indeed be allowed to build in the 21st century. With formidable skill, Merrick juxtaposed just 3 simple materials and managed to create a 17-level edifice with spatial gymnastics, a 40-foot-high stone fireplace, an extraordinary sense of materiality mixed with powerful structural tectonics, and a striking relationship with nature. And then I skip a bit, and I'll just read this bit. This is up to the entry of the house. Here, a physical artifact from Ron Tom is permanently attached to the house. Merrick used his mentor's actual drawing board as his front door. It stands there with aura and as an overt symbolic reference, a portal not only to the house but also to Merrick's architecture. So I was very moved by this door. The fact that has these layers of meaning, that the very designs that came from from pencil that was drawn on the paper that was attached to this door was the very thing that inspired Merrick when he was 14 and inspired everything in his career at the beginning towards the house, and therefore you go through, it's an Alice in Wonderland moment if you like. You're going through the drawing board to get to what it created. So you may have spotted that I said 17 levels, so did Leslie. The very first inspiration to go and see this house was that I was told it had 17 levels, and I actually didn't believe it. I thought that Leslie meant 17 floors, of course. So I was ready to to count them. And of course, I got there. I counted them, as everyone does when they're in the house. And what happens is that there's a main space that is very pure, and then there are many other rooms that meander off around trees. In fact, Paul didn't chop, I think he chopped 1 or 2 trees down in the whole site. And so you just meander around these trees that are right in the way. It's extraordinary. It's a walk in the forest inside the house. And in order to figure out these crazy corridors and stairs, there are some pretty extraordinary drawings. And so I wrote a chapter called The Crazy Stairs and the Building Inspector, and this is my last reading. The endless levels in the house are joined by stairs of different lengths and configurations, from a quarter of a stair into the kitchen to long meandering flights with twists and turns. Between the original house and the new master bedroom wing, there is a moment where the headroom is a mere 5'9". Distracted by this, it's easy to miss the only available position for one's foot on a triangular step that recedes to a point. That the building inspector approved this is a testament to Merrick's charm and persuasion. In fact, after seeing the array of non-conforming stairs, head heights, handrails, and water-filled interior rocks, the inspector apparently said most reverently, "I wasn't here." So, knowing you as a crowd, I didn't want to have you distracted by the slideshow, which I am actually going to give you. I just felt like once you start seeing images, you wouldn't be listening to what I've said. So I'm going to move aside a little bit. Actually, I'm going to stay here and point, and the light can go down. So I'll speak briefly to 20 slides, and then we'll bring Paul up for the conversation. Okay, so, I get to do this. So this you've been looking at for a while. This is taken at night, looking into that main space. And then this is looking up from just outside the single glazing at the main volume with its skylight. In this incredible level of creativity, the last thing on one's mind would be window cleaning, I'm sure. But, green mold does grow on top of skylights under canopies. And so it apparently takes a system of ocean fishing rods and lots of human bravado to get these clean. But you begin to see the drama of the space. And what's quite magical about this is that Paul used regular lumber from the lumberyard. These are not expensive things. They're 2x10s bolted together. And you get to feel that it's a very creative thing to have achieved. Here is a detail on the left with with these bolts, and yet Paul, in an uncharacteristic way, carved the ends. I think springing back to the wistful Frank Lloyd Wright's, love for decoration, perhaps. And on the right, this is one of 42 door handles, which Paul handcrafted himself without a power tool, all of them. And he also sanded down all these beams and columns. And it's the sort of thing that only he and I would know, because, it's a lot of work. It's one of these things like Mies van der Rohe, who ground down the labels inside on the steel beams inside of the walls that nobody would ever see, but he would know. And so that's a testament to Paul's dedication for a perfect job. On the left, there's this is actually a 40-foot stone fireplace, and Paul engaged his 2 nephews to create this. They'd never lifted a rock in their lives, and they will never lift a rock again. And what's exciting is that you can see from this, it starts 1 story below this, and you can see their learning curve cast forever in these rocks. And I noticed recently that it's very interesting that at the very top it kind of falls apart and it's terrible. And I think they just got so fed up. They were lugging these rocks up into the air, many feet up into the air, grinding them maybe 15 times sometimes to get them to fit perfectly. And they were asked by all kinds of Paul's friends to have their fireplaces made, and they didn't touch a rock again. On the right, you can see a bed gallery that is hovering over the main space. The dowel, which was hardly going to stop anyone falling off in the night, was added later apparently, but it's another case of the building inspector thinking, no, just let me out of here. But the window at the end, I'm not sure how well you can see it, but it's a very beautiful window. And it looked like Paul had spent a long time drawing that, and the height of the bed gallery is actually directly in relationship to the height of that window. It turns out that it was a found piece, and that it was actually the height of that bed gallery was dictated by the height of that window that was found. And it's so relevant to the lineage that I talked about. It's just the right level of character in there. So it's going to be an interesting discussion with Paul after, because what I found was that there was a very pure space and a meandering load of corridors and rooms. And I felt like it really was designed from the inside out, that nobody could really see these. These are 3 photographs. Nobody can really see this, and you spending time on the inside. I felt like the priority was inside. But actually asking Paul, where did he get this from? He was saying that he spent a year in Europe loving medieval architecture. And you have to remember, this was kind of towards the end of the 60s into the very early 70s. And, if you remember that period, everything medieval was hailed. And here's a good example of, this is Paul's handcrafted numbers, which, if that doesn't read Grateful Dead, I don't know what. And only a talented architect with a low budget would come up with this one. Paul found that the glazing, the offcuts at the manufacturer were free. So these windows are made up of free bits of glass, which he siliconed together. And what happens is that, see if I can use this thing, is that these lines, they just glisten and glow as rainbows in some lights. It's extraordinary, and yet this was just, a great way of doing it. It turns out that when Paul did a renovation later, he wanted to replicate this. And of course, they didn't have free offcuts anymore, and it was a fortune to cut all these little bits of glass. I don't want to say too much, because then there will be nothing left in the book, but I will tell you that this looks like a really boring front door, but actually this is the drawer, this is the drawing board, this is the door that is so magical. And it makes me realize that, sort of a lesson for students, that it's really necessary to get a deep reading of a house or any architecture. I see students on Google Street View thinking they've seen the Villa Savoye, and it's no. You have to go and feel it, touch it, be with it, learn about the layers of meaning and so on. And here are a couple of details. the detail on the left is not an inside of a Japanese restaurant, and it's not a shoji screen. It's the exterior door, and it's just remarkable that it hasn't gone away. I thought it would rot, but it's quite amazing. It has a big overhang, of course, but the rules that we go through today for sealing up rooms and so on, it's amazing that this can happen. And on the right is a rock in the basement for the kids area where there's water flowing over the rock sometimes, and it flows down to a storeroom underneath that Jeanette and Alistair call wet storage. Now here are the trees. This is the house, and you can see what happened. I'm not going to chop a tree down. It has to be walked around. Here's a little indication of the kind of sketching that Paul did to try and resolve these stairs. If you look on the top left, it's probably a little blurry, but it's an extraordinary mess. And one thing that happens these days with computers is that you just overlay and you erase as you draw, and you don't get the history of what you're doing and how it evolves. And I think Paul at the time, and we all did, we drew and we overlaid and drew, and it's something that's just gone away. It's such a shame. These are such rich sort of memories of the way the designs evolve. But I think Paul was really struggling with these stairs. And when you struggle and create a horrible drawing, this is the stair you end up with. This is the... Oh, sorry. This is the triangular stair that you have to negotiate to get down these stairs. I don't know what Paul was thinking, but it's great. And this is Zafira's drawings, which we had a struggle to figure out how on earth to draw floor plans on 17 levels all at once and not take up the whole book. So we came up with this idea where there's a little axonometric, and if you can see them flicking through, you can see the way they... I've only put two in here as examples, but you can see the way they flick around, and these are the complicated plans. Now, what do you do for an encore? You've designed an incredible house. Everybody's so praiseworthy. And then then you want to renovate. You have family that needs, real rooms, and the parents' bed gallery is no longer very acoustically private. And so only, very few people better themselves once they've done something so well. This is the master bedroom that Paul did as a renovation of that house, with a little bit more budget, I think, and it's turning into an extraordinary renovation. And you can see the skylight up there, and this is a grand entry onto a deck, and this is the... there's another photograph in a minute. Now, with my spy glasses on, thinking, where did this come from? There are many examples down the West Coast of this character of architecture. This is Lloyd Wright, Frank Lloyd Wright's son, from 20 years before this house. But if I look carefully at this house, it's laminated beams, and it's a fortune. This is a very expensive building, and Paul's really, exceeded expectations with the kind of budget that one would have. And you can't see this on this slide, but the cut glass is in these little bits here. And again, all 2x4s, 2x6s, 2x10s. This is the corridor to the master bedroom. And last but one slide, the kitchen stopped here in the original house, and then this is a renovation. And Paul continued that motif of the 3 holes in the doors. And so this is the kind of thing that I think, and we'll find out, this was designed from the inside out, and it seemed like it didn't really matter what it looked like on the outside. So back to the original photograph, I think what's extraordinary is that these single glazed walls create something that feels like you're in a pavilion in the forest where you don't really see the glass because it's single glazed. Unless there's reflection, it just feels like the trees are inside. And that's an amazing experience. And if you get to read the book, you'll find out more about where that came from. Thank you. So what I'd like to do now is invite Paul up, and we're going to try and have a normal conversation, and we'll see how that goes. At the end of this, how's it going for timing? That's good. At the end of our conversation, we'd like to invite Jeanette and Alistair to take questions as much as Paul, because I think it'd be very interesting to hear what they have to say about living in the house and enjoying it every day throughout the different seasons. The one question you can't ask them is how much it costs to heat the forest in winter. I'll clean the windows. Okay, so Paul, thank you very much. I should introduce Paul as if he needs introduction. Paul graduated in 1964 from UBC, and as you know, worked for Ron Tom, and has had a successful practice for over 50 years. And if I can find my notes, I will finish this off. So the kind of buildings that you might know are Cathedral Place, the CBC building, that was my favorite for a long time, until someone renovated it, and it's not quite the essence of the original anymore. Falls Creek, Olympic Village, and in 2014 received the Lifetime Achievement Award from our institute, the AIBC. And so that's normally that's them saying, well, you did very well, thanks very much, retire. But of course, Paul's not going to do that for a second. He has a very lively, very large practice called Merrick Architecture, mostly based in Victoria, and he's doing great work. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Tony. I wasn't sure whether I had operating amplification here or not, but it sounds like I do. If any of you can't hear, way back there, just holler or wave or something, and I'll try and speak up.
So Paul and I are old, and we can sit down. You can sit down.
You sit?
Yeah, you can sit down. So do you want to say anything before I ask some questions?
Well, the first and last thing I'd like to say, because as things often go, liable to not have the opportunity at the end of our conversation is to thank Leslie Van Dwyzer, singularly, in particular, with, she's insisting, her associates, because none of us do any of the things we do in life alone, on our own. But it has, I have come to understand in the journey of creating this narrative that Leslie was the origin of and the force majeure behind the whole of the process, and along with the others that she told us all about earlier, and others yet to come. And I think it's a marvelous thing to be doing, and I'm very humbled to even be a small part of it. Following directly on the heels of that, I need to thank Tony Robbins, who I really have known only as a colleague for years and years, because we've been both at it for a while. To make a long story short, I found myself hugely pleased with the story Tony found he could dredge up out of this. I wasn't entirely aware that it had gone from 9,000 words down to 3. I'm glad you left out the bit on environmental conservation and management, because I don't think we're the best at that. The other thing I'd like to say and acknowledge is that, notwithstanding that this is an architectural endeavor, I've spent a good part of my life trying to understand what indeed that might mean. It's also it was originally initiated as our family's home, and it's now Jeanette and Alistair's family's home, and I'm hugely grateful for the fact that it still is doing what it set off to do, which is accommodate life, and that's what these things always do, and all the stories are around that. I'd like to acknowledge, I think that I know that at least 2 or 3 of my children are here, Kim and Natasha, and I think Nika is either here or going to come later. And one of those children, Maya, is not here because she's in Montreal, but she's going to figure in a story that Tony found he dredged up in the process of exploring the narrative.
Thank you, Paul. So that might lead to a question. By talking to your daughters, I found out that the house that I saw the house as a very quiet, calm, cathedral-like space in the main living area. It turns out it was always full of very loud music, which I loved. It was a whole different take on it. As she said, Bach would be blaring as loud as possible with lots of wine and people, and it was a very different take on it. That was really a comment rather than a question, but I just wondered how on earth the acoustics worked with that kind of sound. You know, I'm just thinking of glass is the last thing we want to put into a place like that when it's really a home full of Bach and Beethoven and so on. But you don't have to answer that.
I thought that was a really important question, not about whether it works well acoustically or not. In fact, you obviously know enough about how sound behaves to know that Tony called it a bright space. He said it must have been very bright. That's a musician's term on acoustic qualities, and it is indeed. And it was actually wonderful. But underneath that story, I thought was the fact that it was a kind of upstairs downstairs happening, and it wasn't quite the same as portrayed in Downton Abbey. It was upstairs were the big people, and downstairs were the children. And it was actually basically planned, and this is the original piece. What Tony didn't expand on is the fact that the whole thing grew in stages, the original piece being the core piece, which is prominent in this image here. And it was basically entered from the high side of the site, and you in such a way that you go half up to the main living level and a half down to the children level, and then on and up another to the retiring space, that bed, balcony, and what was variously a study, nursery, etc. So it worked very easily. Even I think they totaled 943 square feet originally. I had to do that measurement for the municipality. It was never planned around how big it might be, but it worked quite well in a lot of ways without having a lot of just physical dimension.
You know, a lot of people think of that period in 1972 as a lot of students think of it as history, but Paul lived it, as some of us did too. But you know, you were in the heyday of Arthur Erickson and Ron Tom, and I'm wondering what insights special memories you might have, and any insights that really informed your work in that period.
I found myself thinking. Tony shared some of these questions that he thought he might pose tonight with me, and my first reaction to that was, well, Arthur and Ron certainly figured centrally, and so did one or two others, and they all color our life. And over time, I come to appreciate that I think I have found myself in this world doing what we do in some immensely rich company. I had the great good fortune to have Arthur as a mentor or tutor in second year at university. He was really just back from his Eastern travels and doing Philbrook House at the time. And Ron I had learned about before I met by this house, in fact, he was doing for Bruce Boyd over the hill and down the lane on a site that we used to, as young lads, play in the trees of. And we were at first decimated the fact that some of the trees were being taken out to build something. But what then materialized was a congregational space. I don't know how many of you know this house it's on the lower side of Old Duchess. It's block and cedar basically, and it, as many of Ron's houses, had a decidedly modest budget. But what I remember about it as a youngster, because my father was he taught industrial arts, wood and metal and the rest of it, so that was an easy inclination to engender. But he, on an evening or weekend, he would go explore things that were being built, and this was one of them. And I remember being hugely struck by looking up and finding that this top of the room was not indeed flat, it sloped, and it ended up in a triangulation that let light in high in the space, and as it leant against a huge mass of of fire in that case, and seeing that there were other ways of understanding management of shelter. And there are other examples I could go on into. I thought I'd also like to mention, along with Arthur and Ron, who are stories in themselves, that others like Bud Wood have to also be acknowledged. Even Barry Downs, who is the colleague, a longtime colleague, who's one of the other books was done about, and a school of thought, a way of thinking, and a way of life. I think that it seems to me, from a point of some frustration, has been kind of rendered down, not like your sauce to a state of richer being, but somehow cauterized. That we increasingly find ourselves with so much of our society wanting to manage how we behave and how we deal with each other. And in order to do that, we presented with rules and regulations that have to be satisfied. That is not in itself necessarily a bad thing, but unfortunately, in all too many cases, on the smothering side of center. And as Tony's already alluded to, there are, I think at this stage of life, I was inclined to go at things by way of saying, well, and I guess I've come to realize that the brilliance of youth and the wonder of youth is that in our youth, we don't know what we're not supposed to do, so we just go ahead and do it, usually until we're told not to, all too often. But that was certainly at the root of some of what was happening here.
That actually is part of one of my questions, that, as a young architect, I really didn't know much about construction. And I'm wondering how much of a learning curve this house actually was. I think it was the first thing you really got to grips with hands-on making of a house, apart from the boats that you made.
I don't know. I never, well, at least for a good long time, I never considered myself a technician, particularly. But I had, as I said, my father used to take me around houses under construction, so I would see how things went together. And of course, there was a workshop in the basement, and on top of that, maybe before it, I had the great good fortune to have a great uncle who was a bit followed a life kind of on his own radio station. He came out from the old country as a young man, ended up, his name was Roberts, and he's part of the family that settled Roberts Creek, where that ended up becoming our summer place. But about the time I was coming onto this planet, he had relocated up to Nelson Island on 360 acres, and essentially everything he'd done for most of his life, he just did on his own, of his own resources and own ways. And I had an experience, it was also when I was 14 years, I must have crammed a lot into that year, you've reminded me, but in the summer, I got to go and stay at his place on Sunray. And I found myself realizing that I had a beautiful experience there, that it was decades later that I realized was actually a hugely important fundamental lesson in life. Having made my way up on the Jarvis Express and sat on the dock alone for hours before they came and got me, there was no way to get off this raft. And back to the house, dark by now, which was all built of log, and had it was called Sunray because the windows were patterns of sunlight, which I think had some influence on some of my thinking in this case. And wake up in the morning and go down, and Uncle's already baked the bread and got breakfast going some time ago. And he said, well, what are we going to do this summer? And I said, I don't know, I'm 14 years old. So he just shrugged and said, I don't know. And he said, why don't we build a boat? Why don't you build a boat? And I said, oh, I don't know how to build a boat. And he said, well, I'm sure you don't, because you've not done that before, so let's find out what's involved. He said, what do you think is the first thing you need? And I thought, maybe some lumber, something to make it of. He says, well, that's pretty close. He says, but that's not the first, that's the second thing you need. The first thing you need is an idea. and he's talking about that thing, you know, we call it the design, or what's the concept or whatever. He says, you need an idea, a vision, maybe, you know, we use all sorts of fancy words around this notion. So he said, you go away this afternoon, and here's a pencil and some paper, and you know, think about your idea. So the next morning I came back with a boat designed, and he said, okay, now what about that lumber you said? And I said, well, I was going around and discovered the upper level of the old barn. The goats were downstairs, and upstairs was a workshop, and on the wall was a series of lumber all stacked up and spaced with cribbage to air dry it. And I said, well, I found some there. We could use that. And he said, well, maybe we could. He says, but first, before we do, we need to understand where that came from. It didn't come out of the sky. So let's go and make ourselves some lumber. We'll use that because it's been drying a while, and we want dry wood, but we're going to have to replace it before we use it. So we go down to the beach, find some logs. I learned the difference between yellow cedar and red cedar and fir and hemlock, and roll a few into the water and tow them around in the ha to his mill. And we cut some lumber, and then we planed it, and then we packed it over, and we stacked it. And now we're able to go. And that end of that summer, to finish a long story, went home with a boat in tow. And realized that not only did I learn something about how you go from an idea to a result of that idea, but also something that we've come to call, you know, good behavior on the planet, and being environmentally sustainable. That if you're going to take something, then replace it before you consume it, or as you consume it, and not just throw it away. And I had no idea how significant that perspective was in the origins. You asked me about lumber, and just another. I didn't have any money, and common lumber was cheap, so I thought, let's see what we can do with that.
I want to make sure we have time for questions, so I'm going to have one more question for Paul, and that's, if I look back over my career, there are basically two ways to end up with a perfect product at the end. And one is to enjoy the process and see where it ends up, and the other is to think only of this perfect end product. And basically, for me, it's pretty much torture, and probably for my wife too. And so I'm just wondering how it was for you building this house. Was it a joy, or was it really painful to be as perfectionist as you ended up being?
I think it was a joy.
Good for you.
At least
is it just me that?
I hadn't really thought much about it, until you asked me that question, and I thought, well, it certainly wasn't painful.
You can see the delight in things like the door handles and so on. So you were having fun doing that, I can imagine. But you know, it can be difficult.
I mean, the memories that come up at the time. The long story, acquiring this site and then initiating a way of building something on it. As I said, like many of us at that stage of life, you don't have a whole lot of capital means, and I had the good fortune to have a bank manager who would lend me way more than I could ever deal with paying back, and I guess I had a good credential.
That's great.
And so he loaned me the money to buy a lot. It's $15,000. I don't spread that around. You didn't know that, did you? and then sometime a year or two later, in the meantime, all these scribbles started happening that Tony shared some with you. And that was actually a pleasure. It was maybe a kind of a retreat. It's what we often, you know, find the pleasurable part of this this kind of voyage, and just exploring ideas. And it was certainly at an early stage, but there's also not something you'd have any way of knowing until you go into it. But being your own client is quite different than anyone else being your client, because you have no one else to turn to, and no one to report to, and no one to say sorry to or thank you for, because you know, it's just your own show. On hindsight, I have to acknowledge that I think I was probably almost slightly on the selfish side of center when it came to this endeavor, because I don't remember consulting the family, old or young, seeking their opinions or seeing if things were okay. I just did this and went off and borrowed some more money from this good man who was lending it to me and got the house built. With the help of another couple from my life at that point who are still dear friends and here a few rows back, Barry and Heather Grevlin. And Barry and I had worked with Ron before this in Toronto, having been at UBC not exactly the same time, sometime before that. And he had a lot, they had a lot just down the road, and he was already in the design build business. So it was Barry who helped me find people to build this and manage the sort of business of contract and all of that. So thank you for that, sir. I'll never forget.
So thank you very much, Paul. And what I'd like to do now is open up for question time. And if anyone has a question, raise their hands. And then you have to wait until the mic arrives because it's all of this is being taped. So any questions for Paul, Jeanette, or Alistair, or myself? Wow. Oh, yes, Trevor Body at the back. There we go.
Yeah, comment for Tony, question for Paul. Tony, I had the pleasure of reading your manuscript at a late stage without visuals. And I have to say, as writer to writer, it was a wonderful experience. Because just with your words, I was brought back to a house. I'd seen it exactly once, within months of my arrival from Alberta to teach at UBC. And Bud Wood took me to the house. Paul was still there, and it was a party. So there was loud music and lots of red wine, and this amazing house. And I thought, Dorothy, you're not in Kansas anymore. This is was my arrival on the West Coast. So thank you for the words and thank you for the book. Paul, my question for you, these events get a little valedictory, and I don't think valedictory is you or your work. So now I want to ask you about your current work. And when I first looked at the West Bank project for West Vancouver, I instantly thought of the house. And I couldn't think of that design for Horseshoe Bay as happening from anyone but you, and having done that house in particular. And now I wonder, I know they're not the same, it's very different, it's a different density, different details, but would you care to say a little bit about how that house has enriched your subsequent work?
That's a very kind question. You usually ask me quite scathing and incisive, impossible to address kind of questions. Yeah, I think it has. And I suppose each and every one of us goes through life having a fairly small bag of kind of ways of doing things or seeing things. And I guess part of what I was onto here, and probably in some ways was able to do more of it here, more with it here than many things since, was deal with balancing that thing called shelter, which is what every building is fundamentally about, with the management of experience. And we talk about the medium of that being light, presence or absence, and a lot of that perspective I was able to explore, I think, many dimensions of, and in the process learned things that resulted in bits of delight that I didn't even imagine might come out of this through the way glass reflects and light changes and models, and we really do see through it. The other dimension of it, which is more the pragmatic of how do you put two pieces of something together to make a third. This is a story my uncle told me about his 6-year-old daughter when he was building a boat, and he said, "Gee, Dad, I just realized that big things are just a whole lot of little things all stuck together." And I said, how you do that bit, of course, is the light of it. And I realized that in exploring ways of using 2x4s or 6s, small dimensional lumber to create to bundle them and assemble them and so on, and to connect them, as Tony pointed out here, in some essentially simple ways, but ways that actually work. And I realized that I'd already explored some of those not so many years before this, living in an apartment in the West End when I needed a desk and a sideboard and some storage, and found myself, and of course, living in an apartment, there's no workshop. You couldn't make dust and noise and all kinds of other things. And so with a handsaw and a hammer and some galvanized nails, I found they fastened better than ungalvanized, and made some furniture out of double pieces of 1 by something and 1 by 4, 6, and the like. And I actually still have those remnants, and they're stupid simple, and literally cost peanuts to make. And it was the same, that same way of seeing assembly of parts. I still have, I think, some interest in continuing to explore. So I think you're really right, Trevor, that these things do build on one another, and the foundation layer keeps floating up and getting reapplied, reassessed, re-examined. And,
that was a question I had and didn't have time for, so thank you, Trevor. And thank you for your comments coming from one of the two preeminent Canadian architectural critics. I'm humbled a little. Any other questions? I feel like it's such a shame not to include Alistair. No? Jeanette and Alistair have been incredibly kind to me and Paul in the whole process, and are so instrumental in keeping this house alive. So thank you. Thanks for coming. And Leslie's waving and saying, "Do you have any comments? Can you say something?" Yes, you talk.
No, I'm not getting up. I think that, well, you can't really talk to a crowd without getting up. Stand up. I can't do this on my own. We didn't prepare anything at all here. I think that the most telling thing about this house is when you come in. And I walked into the house because I was being asked to try and sell the house for somebody, and I walked in and I fell in love within 15 seconds. And I called Alistair and said, "You have to go and see this house because we're buying it." And he said, "We're not moving. Why are we?" So he went, and we're not selling our house and buying another house. He had no idea until he went and saw the house. And I said, "Wait till the children see the house." And they both got to the house and picked their rooms and said, "Okay, when are we buying the house?" And it took a little while, but we do still have wonderful parties. There's usually a lot of red wine, and there's very good acoustics for very loud music. My boys can both attest to that. And we adore the house. My husband, you get to now talk about trying to maintain it. Not trying, he does maintain it.
I think I don't maintain it, but I am a builder, so I probably was not a bad person to buy the house. But Paul's been talking about perfection a lot. And whenever I work on the house, and a lot of things I had to redo all the decks downstairs, and different aspects of the house are starting to deteriorate, as all West Coast houses do. And I often worry that I'm not doing the perfect thing. And Paul is exceedingly gracious, because whenever he comes to the house, he looks at it and everything that I've done, he says, "That's fantastic. That's exactly what I wanted to do." So whether it's true or not doesn't matter, but it makes me feel really good. But the house is an ongoing work. There's never a finish to anything on the house, so it's constantly deteriorating in one area. I'll fix one area, then I move to the next. That's part of living in a West Coast house, but it's absolutely magical, the house. And anybody who's been there, the first comment always that we get from people who come to the house is usually the first comment is, "You're absolutely crazy for being here." But the people who get the house right away and who fall in love right away say it's the most magical place they've ever been in. And it truly is for me, and I think it is for Jeanette and the boys as well. So it's just an absolutely amazing house.
So I just want to thank everyone again, Leslie, Jeanette, Alistair, Paul. And one little end ditty is that the people who nearly bought the house just before Jeanette and Alistair were going to knock it down. And so we feel like, thank goodness that you bought it. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.